Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Gessel, and I am the Director of Public Programs at Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. MoAD is a contemporary art museum, and our exhibitions and programming inspire learning through the global lens of the African diaspora. As we begin all of our programs, we like to ground ourselves in the spaces we are occupying. As many of us are settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcibly brought to this continent, our institutions were founded upon the exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples on whose land we are located. MoAD occupies the unceded land of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, and we pay our respect to the Ohlone peoples and their elders, both past and present, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We encourage everyone to learn more about the native lands you occupy by visiting native-land.ca. I welcome you today to our monthly program series, African Diaspora Film Club, co-sponsored by Black Public Media. We're back after a 2-month hiatus, and we're happy for the return of Cornelius Moore, who is the co-director of California Newsreel, the 54-year-old social issue nonprofit film distribution and production company. He is also an independent film curator specializing in works from and about the Black world. Modeled after a book club, we expect that you will have already viewed the film when you join us for this discussion today. But if you haven't seen it, please stick around. We just can't guarantee we won't have any spoilers. Today, we'll discuss the acclaimed documentary Hazing with director Byron Hurt. Byron Hurt is an award-winning documentary filmmaker. His acclaimed documentaries, Hip Hop, Beyond Beats and Rhymes, and Soul Food Junkies aired on PBS's Emmy award-winning series Independent Lens. Hazing aired on Independent Lens in September 22, is currently still available on Independent Lens. And his next film, Looking for Lee and Liza, will air on PBS Nova in 2023. We'll start the discussion moderated by Cornelius, and we encourage everyone to participate by making comments and submitting questions through the chat or the Q&A box. And finally, please take a moment to type where you're joining us from in the chat. And if you're comfortable, please let us know if you had to go through any sort of initiation process in your past as well. So I'll turn it over now to Cornelius and Byron.
Hey, thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks for the introduction and for encouraging people to, if they feel comfortable, letting us know if they were in their own initiation fraternity sorority experience. I want to welcome Byron and thank you for being available, and also to thank you for making such a revealing, brave, and brilliant film.
Well, you're welcome, Cornelius, and it's good to see you as always. And I usually see you on the film festival circuit, so it's good to see you here in this space after so long. Hope you're doing well.
I'm doing great, thank you. Same for you too. I am familiar with your work, Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes and Soul Food Junkies, and both those films, you were kind of a character in them, and this film too. Is this would you say this is the Byron Hurt style of filmmaking?
I think so. I tend to create first-person documentaries, although I would not limit myself to telling first-person documentaries. It just so happened that, this was a subject that I have very close proximity to in terms of the issue, and made the decision to include my own personal story in this film, as I did Soul Food Junkies and Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes. And my first film, I Am a Man, Black Masculinity in America. So, it has become somewhat of a style. First-person documentaries are extremely difficult to make. I will say that. So I don't know how many more I have left in me, but I would never impose myself on to a story just for the sake of having myself in the film. The story would have to dictate that.
Well, this is a 10-year journey for you.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I started out, I was 42 when I started, and I ended up 52, with a whole lot more gray hair, so it was really interesting. It's so funny to me because as I watched the film, I can see myself like aging over the over the 10-year process, and so there's the final shot of me on the plane where I sort of wrap up my journey. It was a real journey. I mean, this was not something that was contrived. This was a real 10-year journey.
And because we know each other, and we're Facebook friends, I remember, I guess it was 10 years ago, when you were mentioning and asking people what they thought your new project would be. And I remember that because I didn't get it right. I don't know. I can't remember what I thought you were going to do, but I was surprised that you were going to do the film on hazing. And so of all the things, all the, very urgent and crucial issues, what was it that drove you to do this one?
Quite frankly, it was a story that I read in the New York Times about a young man named George Daydoon, who we feature in the film, and whose mom we feature in the film. And I read his tragic story in the New York Times, and that gave me my first inkling to make a film focused on hazing. Now, when I read the story, I was deeply, deeply moved by it. I was moved to tears, but I still didn't have the courage, I think, to move forward with it, because I knew that it would be very controversial and that it was a very taboo subject. And then I saw the story of Robert Champion, who was a Florida A&M band member who was tragically killed by his bandmates. I watched that on the news, and that's when I said, I want to make a film about this. I think that I can shed light on this issue, and that's what led me to make the film. And I was very nervous about making the film, Cornelius. I mean, all the way through, all the way leading up to the broadcast. Very, very nervous about my position as the storyteller and as a member of a fraternity, because I knew that this was definitely not something that we typically talk about openly and publicly.
So, I mean, with your own story, I have a lot of questions. I learned a lot because I was not in a fraternity. And I mean, I know folk who were in fraternity, Black fraternities. I know nothing about non-Black fraternities. But just from your entry into joining a fraternity, you mentioned in the film how it was a way to have community.
Oh, absolutely.
But I also sort of wonder if because you went through a sports experience, you were a football player for years, if that was a way for you, an entry point for you, and maybe even a willingness to go through some of the hazing and initiation because you had that football experience.
Yeah. Well, I think football was one experience that primed me for, I guess, a hazing process in college. I should mention that I did not go through a hazing process on my college football team. I did go through a hazing process on my high school football team. And it was very jocular. It was not, it wasn't nearly as intense as my college experience. But as I tried to lay out in the documentary, there were moments in my life, starting at early boyhood, where, I was sort of indoctrinated into a culture of violence, where it was the expectation is that you either had to be violent in order to defend or protect yourself. You had to, I was a victim of violence at a very early age, as a little boy. I was a victim of violence in high school. I perpetuated violence, in high school. And so, and junior and middle school. So the idea of weathering a storm that included violence was not new to me, at that point. The question was, how much and whether or not it was needed, whether it was necessary, in order to join a group, an organization.
One of the things that you brought up in the film was a history of fraternities and sororities and the Greek societies, but this particularities for Black folks and why, and it's, I think, in a way, extension of the mutual aid organizations that we had to form to survive and to thrive. And that, you know, while I was not part of a fraternity, my father was in the Prince Hall Mason, my mother was in the Eastern Star, and that's an example of, you know, mutual aid and building community. But when I heard that you were doing the film, and I was, you know, directly asked you, is because of the stigma about Black folks and violence. What? How did you navigate through that? Because, and I'm glad you did have the statistics that Black fraternities are no more violent than white fraternities, in fact, less so. Or, you know, causing deaths. How did you navigate through that? Because that's a minefield.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because that's something that I wrestled with for the entire process, really. Even now, you know, even when I watch the film in the audience now, and, you know, I see the representation on the screen, and I question, you know, the balance of the representation of you know, violence and the way in which I make a connection to violent masculinity. It's something that I really, and we as a team really talked about a lot, thought through a lot, and really tried to make sure that we were not perpetuating any stereotypes. However, the research was pretty clear, you know, everywhere we looked, that there were very different methods that were used in Black fraternities, for example, and white fraternities, and in Black sororities and white sororities. And even in Asian sororities and fraternities, and other you know, organizations of color. So you know, we had to do our research, and we talked to some of the most renowned researchers on hazing culture, and asked about those distinctions. I did not want to perpetuate any additional stereotypes myself, but it was important to talk to people like Dr. Walter Kimbrough, you know, who was an expert on hazing culture, you know, consulting with Mary Madden and Elizabeth Allen, who have done a tremendous amount of research at stophazing.org. But, you know, one thing that Jackson Katz says in the film that didn't make it into film is that, you know, Black men are often viewed as sort of like the face of violent hazing. And it's a shame, because that's not the truth. That's not the reality. The reality is that there's a lot of violent hazing that takes place in white fraternities as well. And even the forced consumption of alcohol, you know, leading to someone's you know, early demise because of a fractured skull. They fall down the stairs, they fracture their skull, or something of that nature. That's a pretty violent death as well. So, you know, I just wanted to nuance out the film and show the cultural differences that exist within these fraternities, so that we can, you know, perhaps come up with the right therapeutics to address these issues.
And I mean, I really appreciate how you lift up the history of fraternities, and even connecting them to sports and the military. There was a program yesterday at MoAD where we had physicians, Black women physicians, talking about you know, health disparities, particularly in the issue of reproductive issues. And I mean, I used that as an opportunity to ask the question: why do doctors, when they're in the training, I mean interns, why do they go through an abusive life situation where they're up for 24 hours at least? It's not necessarily good for them. It's not necessarily good for the patients, but that it persists. And so, like, after thinking about your film, and you're talking about, you know, preparing for this, there's a light bulb went off. Oh, they're doing the same thing. I mean, they're like, they went through the process, and you know, rather than say we want to change that, they've, I guess, adopted the idea that, well, to be a good doctor, or to be tough enough to deal with the adversity you're going to have to deal with. You have to go through this process. And one of the doctors did say, oh, it's a military formulation, the military model. And I had never thought of that. I don't know if you had, but
well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's a matter of life and death, you know, in the case of the military and in the medical field. I mean, they're dealing with life and death, very urgent, very pressing issues. And, you know, that is a way in which they train and prepare people to deal with high pressure situations in which someone could lose their life. That I can understand a little bit more than a college organization or a marching band or an academic club or a sports team that puts someone's life at risk for the sake of in sort of like, indoctrinating them into the organization or the club. But the different spaces where hazing exists is what I wanted the audience to understand, that this was not exclusively a fraternity or sorority issue, that this happens in marching bands, that it happens in, the medical field with nurses and medical doctors, and in the US military. I mean, we had stories that actually talked about each of those spaces, but because we had to cut the film down for our national broadcast, and because we didn't want to overload the film with too many stories, we had to cut many of them down or, include them in montages and that sort of thing. But I don't think that the average person appreciates or realizes that hazing is in many different spaces. It's not just in Greek life and on college campuses. It happens in high schools. It happens on with very, very young boys on athletic teams. And so, it's more of a widespread problem than I think most people believe or understand.
Is it all that stuff something you learned through working on this film, through the process? Or that's something you knew a little bit before?
I knew a little bit before, but I did not understand. Well, I knew that it was beyond Greek life, put it that way, but I did not fully appreciate the extent to which nurses are hazed, right? There was one story that I read, and there were so many stories that we wanted to include, but we just couldn't include them. There was one story about a hazing case at TSA at Newark International Airport, where new TSA workers were hazed by veteran TSA members, right? And they had something called a rape table in which they would sodomize the new workers. Yes, you can look this up. You can Google it right now, right? And it was just a part of like a ritual that they had, at Newark International Airport. I had no idea about that until I started doing research. Firefighters, I mean, you would think that, that's not hard to imagine, because firefighters being, it's almost exclusively male group of people. You can see that kind of hypermasculine culture, including hazing, but it's not well known, I would say. And I actually spoke to a fireman, an African-American fireman who was hazed, and there were some racial implications in his hazing case as well. So yeah, I mean, there were a lot of stories that popped up over 10 years, but I think the vast majority of the stories happen or take place in sports culture and in fraternity Greek life culture.
I want to ask you about how you begin the film. I mean, we talk about fraternities and toxic masculinity, but you also have prominently begin with incident that happened in a sorority. So why did you choose to do that?
I think it was just the compelling nature of the story. Patricia Strong Fargus is a very, compelling person, and the passion that she has for her daughter was something that I felt, and I think that we all felt, as we looked at all of the footage, and we just felt like she was, she would be a really good person, a good story to open the film with. Although we could have opened the film with any one of the stories. But I will say, with that story in particular, Cornelius, I remember reading that story. I had heard about it prior to, working on the film. But when I really started to dig into it and I read that story, I was sitting right over here in my office, and I read that story late at night, and I cried. I cried when I read that story, because I just could not imagine something like that happening to my own child. And also just the nature of the incident. It happened late at night. It was very dark outside. And so I tried to imagine myself being there and being in that situation, to be Kristen High or Kenitha Saphir, and to feel the terror that they must have felt being in that situation. Kenitha couldn't swim, and she was in the ocean blindfolded. Kristen was an avid swimmer and was trying to save her line sister. But they both succumbed to the drowning. I mean, that was just painful to me. I don't know how, as a human being, how you read a story like that and not be moved by it. And so, as a result of reading that story, I reached out to Patricia Strong Fargus, and that's where we began our relationship. And I told her about the film that I was hoping to make. And I asked her if I could interview her and tell her daughter's story, and she agreed. And that's how the whole relationship began. I still stay in touch with with Pastor Pat and all of the participants in the film, because we've developed that kind of relationship over the process of making it.
Well, I mean, that's so evident in the film that the trauma is all throughout the film at various levels, and people trying to figure out how to deal with it, because it's with people for a long time. And I mentioned to you that I think that even before your film was done, I just happened to meet someone who told me that story, and I didn't even know about it.
Yeah.
And she was still traumatized about it, because I think she was there at the time.
Wow.
She couldn't even the idea. I was telling her, this film was going to be important, and she was, I can't even approach it right now, because she related that experience, and she was still traumatized.
Yeah, and when I talk to the parents of children who died as a result of hazing incidents, or what we call hazing incidents, and if you talk to Pamela Champion, Mrs. Champion, who I also keep in touch with and who I love, hazing is not really, it's not the right term to describe what happened to her son. He was murdered. She says he was murdered by his bandmates. In fact, she believes that the word hazing trivialized what happened to her son in the legal case, that followed. But all of the parents, I feel their grief even to this day, and understandably so. It's a terrible thing to lose a child before you die, but to lose your child in such a senseless way, when you send your child off to go to college, to get an education, man, that's awful. I just watched the movie Till, about Emmett Till and his mom, Mamie. And I kept thinking about Patricia Strong Fargus, Pamela Champion. I thought about Wendy Abley, who lost her son Ryan to hazing. I mean, I couldn't not think about them, because the grief on the screen was just so palpable, and you felt the grief of Mamie Till. And I'm not trying to equate the circumstances. I'm not trying to make a direct parallel to something. I'm talking about the grief of losing your child to something senseless that did not have to happen, right? Something that could have been prevented. And that pain that they feel is something that they will feel forever. Pastor Pat said to me on the beach you know, where her daughter died, she said a hazing death is forever. That was very powerful to me. So when I hear people try and trivialize this issue or marginalize the number of people who die every year from hazing, I say, oh, it's not that many. I say, spend a day with Pastor Pat, spend a day with Pamela Champion or Wendy Abley and her husband, Jack, and talk to them about, you know, their child and how they feel about hazing. And if that doesn't move you, if that doesn't transform you, then I don't know what will.
And also, one of the parents and mother was talking about how the people who were victimized by this are sometimes blamed, saying, "Well, why did you do this?"
Yeah.
Rather than it coming from a compassionate point of view, like that someone.
Absolutely. So that was something, that was another hurdle that we had to kind of get over as we were working on the film, is how do you develop empathy and compassion for the people who either died from hazing or experienced hazing and were brave enough to talk about it, right? Because there's always, I mean, I remember I had an early screening at NYU, and you know, I showed some clips from some interviews, you know, to students just to see how they would respond. I was invited by a professor to come in and speak to the students at NYU, and it was amazing to me just how many people blamed the students, you know, who were talking, who were sharing their experiences. You know, it was almost as if they had no right to complain because they knew what they were getting into, or they knew that, you know, hazing exists, or they had the ability to leave or to stop with the process, which is true, but I think it misplaces the blame, you know, when you focus on the individual. Very few people ask the question, why do these practices still exist? Why are people perpetuating this, right? And it's the question that I want people to walk away asking, right? And so I think that that's the kind of attitudinal shift or cultural shift that I think needs to take place in order for there to be any movement on this issue at all. But I will say, and I know this firsthand, those attitudinal beliefs they're very, very, they are strong, you know, they are hard to change and to shift. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done as it relates to education, awareness, you know, and just general exposure, you know, to these issues.
Also, I mean, I learned, so I was talking about this with a friend who was telling me something I hadn't thought about people making a commitment, and they want to continue with the commitment. They may even made a financial commitment.
Yeah.
So it's like you won't get the money back if you pull out. So there's all these complicated reasons why people will continue with it. You know, with looking ahead, thinking at the other end that they're going to be okay, and maybe it will be worth it. You know.
Yeah. Well, you said it well.
Yeah.
You said it well. You said it well. I mean, it's far more complicated than people think. It's not as easy for people to walk away from the experience as people want to believe, especially if you've never been in that sort of experience before, or you've never had that experience. So it is complicated and it is nuanced, and that is what we hoped to convey in the film, that these are complicated, nuanced issues, and they have to be thought about in that way.
Well, I was amazed by the footage that you had of the young man who had the back injury, who had all this footage of the process. And my understanding, this was secret.
Yeah.
So that there wouldn't be that kind of documentation. If there was that kind of documentation, you wouldn't be able to get access to it. So tell us and share as much as you can about that, getting that footage.
Well, you're talking about Brent McClanahan, who's in the film and who pledged Kappa Alpha Psi, and he eventually sued the organization and won. He won a financial settlement, but also he also won he got access to the footage of him while he was pledging, he and his line brothers. And he gave that footage to me. He wanted me to use that footage in the film to show what he had gone through. So it wasn't like, you know, we were looking for that footage, or you know, we did a whole lot of digging to find it. It was Brent gave that footage to us, as well as footage of his line brothers, he and his line brothers in like a car after the first night of their pledge experience. So it was a kind of visual evidence that can be helpful in demonstrating the issue. And we had to be very careful about not overusing that footage, because one, we weren't trying to engage in trauma porn. We did not want to, re-traumatize people. But we did want to show the experience that Brent went through. And also it was something that he signed off on. So that's how we came about acquiring that footage for the film.
So my question is, we're in a period where a lot of things are documented. And earlier, people wouldn't have a video camera, but they do now, so they have phones. So do you know if that process is documented in that way now? Regularly? And
I think, it's hard for me to tell. I'm kind of removed from that process now, Cornelius. Man, I don't really engage in that kind of process. But I mean, you can find all kinds of stuff on YouTube. One thing that I learned that a lot of fraternities do is they set up private, secret Facebook or online groups, that are for members only. And that's where a lot of information is shared. I know with James Vivenzio, he pulled a lot of, information. James Vivenzio is another participant in the film. He was able to pull, or I guess download, a lot of footage that was shared in a private Facebook group page at Penn State University. And James Vivenzio was a member of a white fraternity. So he had mounds of visual evidence that had been posted onto social media. It was a private group, but it was still posted on social media. And I think, there's I mean, when I was online, we took pictures and we took photographs, right? I mean, those photographs, became a memory of your experience, something that you went through and that you endured and that you successfully, successfully overcame, right? So today, I think that there are a lot of groups that are figuring out how to, I guess, navigate a world where social media is just so prominent, and it's a part of everyone's lives. I read a New York Times article about a sorority at the University of Alabama that forbids cell phones at any parties or any, pledge sessions or anything like that. They don't even allow people to even bring cell phones in, so that nothing is documented. And that has become the way that young people are navigating the world of social media, as a means of self-preservation.
Okay, that's all fascinating about the world that we're in and how people use media or don't. And I guess the fact that people are taking pictures of it, and maybe they're not sharing it widely, but it is documented, so that if they're doing it, then they think that whatever's happening is okay. They wouldn't hide. I mean, they wouldn't film it if they thought, oh, we want to hide this, but they still think they're doing okay.
I agree.
So a question to you as a filmmaker, because you're dealing with family and members and of survivors, and who they're sort of reliving this again, when they're talking to you in the film, and maybe that they're called to do this because they want to rectify the situation and tribute to their loved one, but also to prevent anything like this happening to anyone else. So how did you grapple with this as a filmmaker when well, I guess you are experiencing them going through this again, through these emotions?
Yeah, Cornelius, I had never made a film where I had to interview people who lost a loved one, and that was the focus of the conversation. My own parents lost their firstborn son due to gun violence. And he was a child. It was like an accidental, gun violence situation. And I grew up with that trauma. I grew up with the, just the real possibility that something bad happened, and that wasn't really talked about a whole lot. It was just something that was just there. So I think that I kind of walked into this project with a certain level of sensitivity that I may not have had I not been a part of a family that experienced that kind of, trauma already. But for me, it was just really about just demonstrating as much care as humanly possible, doing my best to be as clear and as transparent as possible about my intentions and the kind of story that I was trying to tell. There was some relationship building that had to take place, prior to shooting the documentary. And again, just trying to be as empathetic as possible. I mean, there were, a couple of families that had questions that, they did not want me to ask, right? Or they wanted to see the questions prior to the interview, which we respected and stayed within the, the boundaries, if you will, that they had set for us. So it was that kind of, as I said before, relationship building and demonstration of care and concern, for the parents, and really just being really careful about how I ask questions and, how I framed the questions that I asked them and stuff like that. That's how we got through it. And I have to give, everyone in the film who did share their story, I have to give them a tremendous amount of credit because they didn't know me. They didn't know me from a can of paint. I mean, I showed everyone. I didn't show everyone Soulful Junkies or Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes prior to, but I think I did show, several of the participants so that they could see my previous work and just get a sense of how I dealt with, big issue, stories. So that's what we did. And I think that it worked. So they had to give me a lot of trust in order for them to participate. And I respect that.
I think it shows in the film that your relationship with the parents. I mean, to me as a viewer, and I respect you for that. And I also give you much respect for circling back to acknowledge some of the harm that you may have caused when in this whole process, when you're talking to Eve Joseph.
Yeah, Yvel, yes.
So talk about that and the process of maybe finding him. Were you in contact with him over the years, or you just said I really wanna demonstrate what we know that we need to. There's some accountability here, and I want to rectify that.
It goes back to your earlier question that you asked me about including myself in my own films. And when I decided to take on this particular topic, one of the reasons why my hands got sweaty, just at the mere thought of taking on this issue is because it was so deeply personal. It's because I have been in the room. So when I saw stories featuring George Nadoon or Robert Champion or Rhett McClanahan or Johanna Birch, or I read their stories, I can imagine being there. What I was talking about earlier about, Kristen High and Kenitha Sophia, I could imagine being there because I was so close to it. I was someone who was in that space. And so the way that I looked at it, Cornelius, is that I could not make this film without sharing or disclosing that I had been a part of this world. And I felt like if I did not include my story, I feel like I would not be intellectually honest with my audience, right? And the people who know me very well. I could have done that. I could have opted to leave myself out of it completely. That could have been a choice that I made, but I chose otherwise, and I knew from my previous experiences working on first person documentaries is that if you're going to include your film, you have to be all in, right? If you're going to tell a personal story, you have to really be vulnerable. You have to disclose things that may make you feel uncomfortable, right? Or that may reveal something about you to the audience that they did not know about you before. And it may not make you look good. And so it was important for me to share that not only did I experience this as a participant, as a victim of hazing, but I also perpetuated it as a member of an organization. And the way that it came about with Evel is that, Evel and I, had several conversations with each other, had gotten back in touch with each other. And, we just, Evel and I talk about real things. We talk about, just being authentic in our relationships with each other, with our fraternity members. And without disclosing too much information, we just had a series of conversations that led to that particular moment where I was, in Boston, and I used my cell phone, to ask him some questions about, his pledge experience and what he remembered from, being with and around me as his big brother while he was pledging. So that's how that happened.
And I think it's an important bridge in the film.
I think it's a really important bridge, and people often cite it as one of the most powerful moments in the documentary because of the vulnerability that each one of us share, and also because of the fact that Evel had not shared this before publicly. That was a powerful moment, and I think the audience feels the sense of relief that he feels as opposed to talking about it, publicly. So it was a deep moment. And I thank Evel for entrusting me to include that in the film, because I think it's very meaningful and significant. And I think it models what I would like to see happen. I would like people to begin to talk about this in a very open and earnest way, because I think what helps to drive hazing culture, what fuels hazing culture, is the silence. The fact that, so many people keep so many experiences of trauma deep inside, buried, where they don't talk about it, not even to themselves. And that's been my experience since releasing the film. My experience has been people, my own fraternity brothers included, reaching out to me and telling me about things that they never talked about before, injuries that they sustained while pledging, broken clavicles, broken sternums, the emotional abuse that they went through. They're opening up and they're sharing those stories with me. I was just with many of my fraternity brothers just a couple of days ago, and they were sharing some, and these were older brothers who pledged in the 70s, and they were sharing stories with me, so the film, they could identify with the film. And so for my fraternity brothers and people who see the film, they're moved by it.
Well, definitely. And my question also is, in the world of academia where this happens, have you gotten a new response from, I guess, deans of students or the staff people who are responsible for relationships with Greek organizations? What have they said about the film? Have they had a chance to say anything yet? Because it's very new. I mean, it just premiered a few months ago.
I have a lot of people who work in academia who want to show the film, who want to use the film as a tool. I haven't had any, I don't think that I've had anyone like dean of students who have reached out to me directly. But I have had a lot of people who work on college and high school campuses who want to show the film and who have already shown the film. The film premiered 1 week ahead of National Hazing Prevention Week.
Mm.
And that was by design. That was my target date, when I wanted the film to air, because I wanted to have some traction nationally where people were paying attention to this topic and this issue. And so, there were a lot of people who showed the film or requested to show the film during that week. And subsequently, there are a lot of, educators who want to show the film, for their students. So I'm hoping that the film is going to have a long shelf life, and that educators, faculty members, deans of students and that sort of thing will use the film as a tool on college campuses and high schools and wherever it's needed. That's why I made the film. I made the film so that it will have an impact. I made the film so that people who are already doing this kind of work will stimulate dialogue, use the film to stimulate dialogue and discussion, and hopefully to transform the culture. I was thinking about this the other day when I was exercising. I was thinking to myself, well, how do I really feel like hazing culture can end? Like, do I really believe that? Because someone said to me recently, said, I don't think it's ever going to end. And so I had to ask myself that question: do I really believe it's going to end, or what? And I don't think that my film Hazing is going to end hazing. I think that my film is going to be one piece of the puzzle that will eventually help change the culture so that hazing is something that is no longer socially acceptable at all, right? It's like it's seen as like a really, really outdated practice. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so I was thinking about, I was walking into Trader Joe's the other day to do some shopping, and I forgot my my bag, because in New Jersey they changed the laws so that they no longer give out plastic bags or paper bags. You have to bring your own bag. They probably do that in California.
Well, you can pay for a bag.
You can pay for a bag. Yeah, you can pay for a bag, but they're trying to encourage people to bring their own bags, right? Mm-hmm. And I always forget my bag. I go into the store, I forget my bag, I have to go back out and get my bag, right? And I was thinking about how culture change is not easy, right? But it's possible. Mm-hmm. Because I never bought bags to a store before to put my groceries in, but over time, culture changes. Society shifts, right? You could watch a football game in NFL or in college football, and there are all sorts of rules that are now in place to protect the quarterback or to protect receivers when they're vulnerable and they're catching a pass, right? Back in the 80s and the 70s, you could do things then that you can't do today. They're illegal. You'll get a penalty if you do that, right? And so I think we have to view it the same. We have to change our attitudes. We have to change our behaviors. We have to change laws. We have to make it, systemic. Like, you have to make systemic changes so that eventually the culture begins to shift, and that it's no longer acceptable in the same way. I play football, right? I look at, when I watch football games today, I see things are not the same when I played. The shoulder pads are smaller, the helmets, they wear these things over the helmet during practice to prevent people from getting concussions and stuff like that. When I played football, I didn't have a leather helmet like Red Grange did, right? I mean, I had a helmet with a face mask and, more pads. So society changes. The culture changes over time to protect people from being hurt or injured, and so I think that the same is possible wherever hazing culture exists.
Very wisely said. And you're not saying, well, I went through that, I played football with all that stuff. These other people can do that. So
well, some people do. Some people do, but those are people who are like sitting on the couch, looking back at the good old days and, not taking into consideration that how they played the game was not safe and was not healthy. And the reason why they can't walk, without a limp is because they didn't have those rules in place that they have today, right? So we're trying to make society safer and better. That's the goal.
So I want to acknowledge that there are a bunch of questions. So why don't we start taking them? The first one is, do you think hazing is a remnant of slavery and maybe one of the reasons it still happens today?
well, Dr. Stacy Patton talks about that in our film. I think it's a really strong parallel. I don't want to diminish the the horror and the terror of slavery and slavery culture. Not slavery culture, but slavery as an institution, excuse me. But I will say that, as it relates to Black and brown people, especially Black people, I think that there may be some vestiges of slavery that have been passed down through generation to generation. So yes, but that's as it relates to, the Black Greek letter organization community. As far as white people, I mean, I think that that's, the kind of violence that takes place in white fraternities and in some cases sororities, I don't think that has anything to do with slavery. I think that just has to do with this, the notion of power and dominance over others, making people submit to a hierarchy in which people can abuse power and authority.
Okay. And the next question is at the hour 20, I guess 20-minute mark, you started to ask questions about hazing victims who ultimately became the victimizers of the new crop of pledges. And I'm wondering where you place blame and how the cycle stops if the process is embedded into pledging. You kind of dealt with a little bit, but
yeah, I just think it's a lot. I'm really into education and awareness and prevention. And I think that that's, if we put more effort into that, I think that we can begin to see a cultural shift. And I think we also have to trust young people to come up with new ways of creating experiences where there is no physical or emotional abuse or humiliation or shame that is required in order to become a member of a group or an organization. I mentioned to you earlier that when I went to college, and I became a member of my college football team, there was no hazing involved. Once you earned that scholarship, or once you made it onto that roster, you were a member of the team. Now you had to earn your position. If you wanted to see playing time, you had to work hard. You had to, be a leader. You had to attend the meeting. You had to do everything required of being a member of that team, but there was no hazing. And I'll never forget, when I was a senior, we got a new head coach, and the seniors wanted to implement a hazing process for incoming freshmen. They were trying to, create new traditions. And I was staunchly opposed to it. I remember we were in a meeting, we had a seniors only meeting where we were trying to figure out how we can change the culture of the team. And they proposed that, and I was adamantly against it. And I had gone through a hazing experience. And I said, that's not something that we have to go through. Right. And so I was against it, and it didn't happen. And I just think that, that kind of leadership needs to take place in order to thwart or to change the culture. It requires people who stand up and use their voice against the group, which is a very, very difficult thing to do. But I think that's how ultimately you create change.
Okay, great. And there's another question from somebody who might know you. You have the same last name.
Jerome Hurt.
Jerome Hurt.
What's going on, cuz? Yeah.
So I know you're a proud member of your fraternity. Your daughter, in a few years, will be going to college. What do you say to her? What would you say to her if she wanted to pledge?
People ask me that question often since I made this film. I don't know. I have to see when I get there. I mean, there's a part of me that would love for her to be a member of a sorority, a sorority that wears the color red in particular. However, as long as the culture of that organization does not include hazing, and that she's not going to be harmed in any way, and that was very clear, and it was a part of the culture of that particular organization or that chapter. I think I would be okay with it, but I do not believe that she needs to go through a process in which she is, hazed to her own detriment, because she's not hazed at home. I mean, we don't use physical violence, or emotional abuse to help develop her as a human being. And I don't believe that my daughter or anyone else's child needs that in order to be seen as a valuable member of an organization. And our child is a beautiful child. She's a healthy child. She's a child who knows how to express herself. She's free. She's free from, a culture of violence and abuse in her own household. And so I certainly would not want to send her off to college and expose her to any of those kind of abuses, just so that she can become a member of an organization.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
There's one kind of more of a statement, but in the chat. Thank you for the film. Surely there is a fraternity chapter organization that has implemented a mandatory follow-up series for pledges that acknowledges the possible negative effects, psychological, physical, of hazing, and 2, asks members of their graduate chapters who are professionally trained therapists to facilitate these sessions. There is a teaching opportunity here in terms of being an abuser or subject of abuse.
Yeah.
Also, how holding all of this in can seep out to family and friends.
Well, one thing I do want to be very clear about is that at least in the D9 community, there are, membership selection processes in place that are designed to eliminate hazing. And all of these organizations have those in place. And so I want to be clear that, these processes are beginning to take hold. However, not everyone adheres to that particular process, right? And that's why hazing continues and it persists. That's why I think it's important that there has to be, there has to be a new way of thinking, right? And there has to be an acceptance that the old way is no longer acceptable. And this is how we're going to move forward from this point on. So I think that those sound to me, just on the face of it, those sound like some really good suggestions there.
So we're almost at time. It went by real quick.
It did.
Final things you want to say about to the audience, and also maybe also let people know how to access the film.
Well, when a film comes out and you direct a film, especially when you're in it, you tend to get a lot of attention and people focus on you as a director. But I could not have made this film, and Cornelius, you know this. I did not make this film by myself. There was a huge team of people who helped to support me to make this film, from my producer, Natalie Bullock Brown. Early on, my producer was Denise Green, who currently works at Black Public Media. My editor, Jessica Lee Salas, and everybody. I won't name everyone because there's way too many to name, but just everyone who was a part of the creation of this documentary. I thank them from the bottom of my heart. I'm grateful for their commitment, their dedication to helping me achieve, this goal, the completion of this project, so that we can put it out there, out into the universe for it to do its work. And also all of my funders, including Black Public Media. And it should be said that up until Lee and Liza, the film that's my next film, Black Public Media has funded and supported all of my films since I graduated from college, and I'm very grateful and thankful to them for their support. But ITVS, Firelight Media, the MacArthur Foundation, Artemis Rising. I mean, there's a list of funders who supported this project, and would not be done without them. And then the last thing I would say is that if you haven't watched the film yet, you can watch the film at pbs.org/hazingfilm, pbs.org/hazingfilm. It will be available there until December 11th. And then hopefully it'll be streaming on one of the streamers following that period.
And can people follow you on a website? Or
yeah, they can follow me at Byron Hurt on Facebook and Instagram. I'm not on Twitter all that much, and probably will be even less so now. But if you can just at Byron Hurt is how you can find me.
And you can also find your other films for Beyond Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes and Soul Food Junkies on Canopy, I believe.
Yes.
So people can
Yes.
familiarize themselves with your previous work. Great.
Yes. Well, thank you, Cornelius. It was great to catch up with you.
It's my pleasure, and I feel real privileged to be talking to you today. So thank you.
You're welcome. I appreciate it. And thank you, Elizabeth, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation.
Absolutely. And thank you, Byron, so much for your film. And I know that it will be part of changing this culture because it's so powerful and so important.
Thank you.
So thank you all for coming today. I want to let you know what's coming up next month on Sunday, December 11th from 12 noon to 1 p.m. So a little earlier time. We're going to be discussing the documentary Restitution, Africa's Fight for its Art with director Nora Philippe. She'll be joining us from France. So that's why we have the earlier time. And I put the link to register for that in the chat. You can find it also on our website at moadsf.org. We're also going to be co-presenting a community screening of the film, followed by a panel discussion with Black Public Media and the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art about the issue of restitution and returning African art to the continent. That's going to be on December 8th from 4 to 6 p.m. Pacific, and you can find out more about that on our website as well. I'd love for you all to take the online survey that I put a link to in the chat, and then it also will pop up when you leave this program. It just takes a few minutes, and we'd love to hear your feedback about the program and our programming in general at MoAD. We always would love for people to become members or to donate any amount that you can to help us continue to do this kind of programming. You can donate on our website, moadsf.org. Or you can text a donation to 56512 and type the word MoAD SF and then follow the link to donate. I'll put that in the chat also. And finally, if you are in the Bay Area or you're traveling to the Bay Area anytime soon, we have a beautiful exhibition called The New Black Vanguard, curated by Antoine Sargent, and it's on view through March 5th, 2023. So come and see us and check out our website to see what other kind of programming we have going on. And please support Black film and filmmakers whenever you can. Thank you. Have a great evening, everyone.
All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.